Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our Japanese Politics 101 room. Every Sunday, Timothy Langley, who runs a company in Tokyo that focuses exclusively on Japanese politics, government and public affairs, and host Pai Matsuoka, bring to you the latest developments in Japanese politics. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Thank you for joining us today, the 52nd week of this room, the first anniversary. Thanks to Timothy, we have been doing it for a year now. So Timothy, what did we talk about last week? What are we going to talk about this week, once again?
Thank you very much, Maya. So I'd like to talk about the high points that we discussed last week, and then just give a little bit of update on those things that we talked about, because there has been movement. We talk every week, and every week something happens. There is always something that's going on. So I'd like to fill you in on that. And then I'd like to get to the beef of my presentation today, which is mostly about internal LDP politics and this power play that's going on in anticipation of the upper house elections, which will be in July. So as you know, the Diet is in session, 160-day session. It started in the second week of January. It means that in the Budget Committee room, one of the largest committee rooms in the Parliament, the Prime Minister and his cabinet sit and are questioned by the opposition and also by the LDP. It is televised and it generates a lot of insight into what's going on. The Prime Minister's popularity took a hit last week. It was somewhat significant, so we talked about it. He was riding pretty high, as usual, in a new administration. There is a bit of a honeymoon period. We are through 100 days of his administration, so it is about time that the gloves come off and people get a little bit more serious about what he's proposed to do, what he said he's going to do, what he's doing right now, and some of the mistakes, the missteps, maybe some of the scandals. There hasn't been a huge scandal so far. But that happens at around this time in the administration. His popularity took about a 5% hit since the last time it was polled. They usually hold a poll once every month, and then they report that and circulate it, and it becomes a big topic of conversation for about a week. His popularity is still over 50%, but it's a little bit less than 55%. And it's a continuing kind of slide. Ever since those numbers came out, there have been other things that are happening in the background that indicate or show some lack of leadership or lack of confidence. There are two things that have happened this last week that somewhat indicate that. The first one is the UNESCO identification of Sado Island as a UNESCO site. There were two forces opposing and promoting that as a UNESCO site. The opposition was actually Mr. Kishida, because of his the opposition from South Korea and their insistence that Sado, the gold mine in Sado, represents the enslavement and the abuse of South Korean and Korean workers during the colonization period. The Sado Island mine has been in operation for 80 years. It was at the time of its height the technological showcase of mine technology. It was world renowned for how it was mining, and the Japanese have typically been very, very good at mining. And then during the colonial period, they did have South Korean workers there. There are reports of abuse and slave labor being used there. The forces that were promoting the UNESCO certification was by Mr. Abe and Takeichi for showcasing Japan and the pride of Japan. It's no longer a mine island. The mine has closed about 20 years ago, but it is representative of Japan's push for wider recognition. In any event, there was opposition there. The Kishida administration didn't want to upset the very tenuous relationship that it has with South Korea. The United States has really pushed the Japanese to solve these problems and to be a little bit more milder in diplomatic relations with South Korea. It's tough. They're going to have a new president within the next month. Mr. Abe continues to assert his prominence in foreign policy and in diplomacy. And so there's this tension there. It turns out that Mr. Abe's arguments won over. So even though Mr. Kishida was promoting, let's put it aside, let's not rile things up, in fact, the decision was to promote the UNESCO opportunity. So that's moving forward, and it did kind of end up with a little bit of egg on the Prime Minister's face, which is not something that he had planned for. I also talked last week, because it's important, Okinawa is important in terms of the self-defense forces, in terms of the nuclear umbrella provided by the United States, in terms of the U.S.-Japan alliance. It's just very important. Okinawa hosts more than 90% of all U.S. forces in the entire country here. And there are several major bases there. There's the Navy base in Naha, there's the Air Force base in Kadena, and there is the Marine base in Futenma. It is a huge base, and over the years, I grew up in Okinawa, and I'm very familiar with the situation there. Over the years, the city of Futenma has grown around this massive base. It's a huge base. They do training. They do helicopter runs. The Marines are training there all the time, and flying into and out of it. Sometimes windows have fallen off of helicopters and damaged schools and playgrounds. There have been crashes, and the Okinawan desire to have a safe and secure living arrangement in Futenma has really infiltrated the politics there. So through several agreements between Tokyo and the United States, they've decided to move many of the Marine presence, some to Guam, and others to a place called Henoko, which is a spit of land not as populated as Futenma, and to get out of Futenma and have a new Marine base that requires them to pour land into a harbor and create man-made land there. The election for the mayor of Nago was last week, and the LDP candidate, the person who is supporting the central government, won, and the opposition candidate lost. So this opposition for dumping more earth into the harbor continues, and in light of the governor's Denny Tamaki's election for governor to replace himself as governor in August, the central government wants him out so that they can have somebody that's a little bit more malleable. They have withheld funding, economic development funding. There's a very famous university there, OIST. They've withheld funding for OIST just to kind of rub their nose in it. And if you're not going to be towing the line from the central government in Tokyo, there are ways that we can make things uncomfortable for you. So it's a big deal. It's a big deal for the Okinawan forces who are opposed to Tokyo strong-arming them once again. So that was a topic of conversation. There's more to report on that as other by-elections and local elections happen, but the big kahuna is the election or the re-election of Governor Tamaki in August. That follows what happens in the upper house election. So there could be a dynamic between the upper house election and what's going on in Okinawa, also in light of what's going on with Ukraine, China, Taiwan, and North Korea. We talked quite a bit about Japan's changing philosophy of now living with the virus rather than zero tolerance. 37 of the prefectures, almost all prefectures now are living under some quasi-state of emergency, which allows the governors to exercise some control over how businesses are run. Are they serving alcohol? Giving economic development for those firms that are suffering, hotels, restaurants, and also, limiting when they can be serving alcohol and how many people can be sitting at the table. The Tokyo Governor Koike is really reluctant to ask much more of the central government because she wants to have the ability to keep the Tokyo population calm. There is a kind of a trigger point when the number of beds in Tokyo, in the Tokyo example, exceeds 50% occupancy, that they will go into a higher level of quasi-state of emergency. And Tokyo exceeded this week 50%. It's about 50.7% of hospital bed occupancy. And under a strict calculation or interpretation, Tokyo would be under a heightened state of emergency. She doesn't want to pull that trigger yet. The Omicron infection rate is huge. It started out in January, 500-600 in Tokyo, and it is mushroomed now. Thankfully, it is not as lethal, but it is virulent, and so it is filling up the beds. I think we'll see a little bit of movement this week on that. It also impacts the number of shots and booster shots that are available. You know, it's funny. Even Bangladesh has a higher percentage of people who have received the booster shots. Japan, once again, it's like when we were first talking about the inoculations, when it first became available, that there was such a slow rollout. Then they caught up and they exceeded the other group of 7 countries in terms of how many people have been inoculated. We're having the same problem now. It's just, you know, the same story again. The booster shots are available. First responders, hospital workers, essential workers were supposed to receive their first doses. The Japanese government has allocated 14 million doses and distributed those. However, they kind of sit in waiting. So about 3% of that classification of first responders, essential workers, has been inoculated, and it is raising a bit of concern among several people. You've probably heard that Konotaro, who was the kind of finger quote czar of the booster shots and the inoculations, he has moved on. As you know, he ran for prime minister and lost, and now he's running PR for the LDP. It's an internal party post, but he does speak out from time to time. He spoke out this last week about border closings and also about inoculations. So I think he was one of the driving forces of getting the self-defense forces involved in providing the booster shots. And this is another idea that's come up. Booster shots will be once again administered through the same facility in Kasumigaseki, actually in Marunouchi. And also Yamagiwa Sensei from the lower house, he is the new czar of vaccinations, and that is going to be rolling out with much more energy this next week. You will see a lot of news on that, and some of the notices for people that are 65, 60 years and older has already gone out, but you will see a rush for that. We're still talking about what we talked about last week with a little bit of updated flavor. We talked about the economy. The economy is not looking very sharp these days. It looks like if there is another wave, there are 2 thoughts on that. There is another variant that has been detected. It's come into Japan in very minor numbers, but it is more virulent than the Omicron, but they don't know about its fatality rate. It is just coming up, but they're saying about the economy, if another wave hits, it really is going to knock the dirt out of the Japanese economy, which is already suffering. The employment rate is beginning to tick up. It did in December and January. It looks like it might hold firm, but other analysis has said that, you know, with the falling birth rate of Japan and the number of people who are at working age now, but in 5 or 10 years are going to be in retirement age, the Japanese cannot keep their economic machine going without the inclusion of actually massive foreign workers. They just can't keep up the growth. They need to have people working in Japan. The number of people who are coming in are most numerous from China and Vietnam, strangely enough. And this is for like line workers or independent workers that are coming in for agriculture and heavy labor type of things. That is going to continue into the future. The unfortunate thing is that Japan doesn't have a very good record in terms of how they treat these foreign trainees and the people who come in, asylum seekers, that sort of thing. And also, the Japanese need to reform the immigration law in order to account for that. There has been many calls for bringing all of the financial workers who are departing Hong Kong in droves to come to Japan and have Japan to be an economic hub. That just doesn't look even feasible. I mean, as much as Governor Koike talks about it, as much as other people in the government talk about making Japan a hub, the infrastructures are not there, the schools aren't there, the receptivity of the Japanese people towards that kind of a movement is just not there yet. So it doesn't look like that's going to happen. So it's more higher tech. It's adding higher value to keep the Japanese economy going. They have several major challenges to face there. So in policy and in politics, that's going to be coming up. Probably not before the upper house election. It's too delicate. So just the tried and true issues will be front and center, and that will occupy a lot of the conversation between now and when that happens in July. We talked also about defense and constitutional reform. Those two are tied together because the Constitution forbids Japan from having offensive capabilities. And with North Korea firing its seventh rocket since January, this is huge. 7 rockets since January, whereas before that, for 2.5 years, there has been it's been very quiet, based on probably a lot of things that was done by President Trump, former President Trump. He visited and met with the North Korean leader, and that brought a lot of stability. It looks like that's breaking down now, and 7 in one, in a 30-day period is pretty big, and the indications are that it is going to increase. So how Japan prepares for that, they can rely on the United States for providing some level of protection, but I think many in Japanese politics, especially within the LDP, have come to the conclusion that it's about time for Japan to stand on its own, to provide more of its own defensive capabilities, which includes the threat of offensive capability to be a first strike. So we continue to move in that direction. The United States and Japan, the alliance is strong. The new ambassador from the United States and from the Biden administration has taken up residence. He hasn't presented his credentials to the emperor as yet. That might occur this week, and that's always a big deal. He has been out and about. He took a walk to actually the foreign ministry to meet with Mr. Hayashi this last week out in the sunshine. Big delegation, caused eyebrows to raise. I think he's going to be good for the relationship, but he's going to be really focused on the U.S.-Japan defense capabilities, how Japan and how the United States are going to be strong in light of the Chinese incursions. Their incursions into Taiwanese airspace 2 weeks ago was just enormous. In 18 months, there had not been as huge an incursion with fighters and bombers and surveillance aircraft, scrambling jets in Taiwan just before the Olympics started. So there's a lot at play here. North Korea, Taiwan, China making those kind of incursions. And you can't say much more other than, the Olympics started. They started a couple of days ago. The formal start, I think, was on Thursday. So we've got that for the next 10 days, and then the Paralympics as a part of that. So probably nothing is going to happen during that period of time, which includes Ukraine. Russia and China are really cozying up, causing a lot of consternation, and also the Biden administration very upset. And I don't know if it's actually saber rattling, but they are causing a lot of concern. Some say unnecessarily with regard to what's going on in Ukraine. Right now, with the Olympics going on, we can anticipate that not much will happen, and probably even after that, because what's going on in China in terms of the 100-year celebration. But it's always something to keep your eye on, and it's also always something that we talk about because it's an issue of great importance. The Japanese defense budget increased by 10% this last week. It's 8th year for increase, and the adaptation of higher quality, higher technical weapons, not just from the United States, also from other countries like Israel, on forming even dual-use capabilities. This will continue even in light of the fact that under certain interpretations, it is illegal under the Japanese Constitution. That is going to continue, so the Liberal Democratic Party is hell-bent on changing the Constitution. They've already passed the referendum in the Abe administration to deal with how you would change the Constitution, a referendum vote. They've changed that law. They've updated it. So the pieces are in place to change the Constitution. What you need next is a 2/3 vote in the upper house, passed by a 2/3 vote in the lower house, and then it goes for a referendum to the Japanese public for everybody that votes. Not everybody's going to vote, but for those people that vote, if they get more than 50% that votes with the proposal provided by the Japanese Diet, then the law would be changed. And that is why the upper house election coming up in less than 6 months is so critical. And that's why the Japanese government, the LDP, and the opposition parties are spending so much time developing a response to that. We talked briefly about the digital agency, MyCard, the fax and Hanko, the biometrics. That is continuing apace. There is not much to be expected from the digital agency because much of the work that they're doing now, they received their budget. They've been in, it's been a year, 1-year anniversary, just like us, Maya, since the digital agency was formed, a great achievement by former Prime Minister Suga. So they're putting a lot of pieces in place. It's not something that is going to be too obvious to us. It needs a little bit of time to filter through the various ministries and get the cohesion that's required. But I think it's like with the booster shots, once they get their ship in order, you will see lots of change. So what I'd like to talk about today, and I've been going on for about maybe 15, 20 minutes. I apologize for that. I want to talk about the dynamics within the LDP, what Mr. Kishida's standing is there, and what's the prognosis for moving forward in terms of diplomacy. Mr. Kishida, should be a well-practiced and skillful diplomat in terms of geopolitics and Japan's standing. He was the longest-serving foreign minister, and so you would think that this is a strength of his. He did have a talk with President Joe Biden 2 weeks ago, maybe 10 days ago. The news and the decisions and the topics that they talked about have been filtered out since then. One of the decisions, one of the talks that they've had dealt with, defense capabilities and sharing of drone technology. There's been movement on basing a drone squadron in southern Japan. There's also a decision for the president to visit Southeast Asia, primarily to visit with Japan and have a Quad meeting here, probably in May. So May is maybe a month and a half before the upper house election. This will be a big boost for the prime minister, showcasing him as a world leader. The Quad would include, the prime minister of Australia and the president of India as well. So that's a big win for him. But in terms of numbers of people in the LDP who belong to Mr. Kishida's faction, he's actually number 5 in standing. He's not the first or the second largest faction in the LDP. He's actually number 5. So he has to accommodate some of the big kahunas, and I think that's why he kind of got into trouble with the Sado Island issue. It was an issue that he wanted to soft pedal, and former Prime Minister Abe wanted to put on the front burner. The Abe faction is, he's not the titular head. He is the head of the Abe faction. The former head, Mr. Hosoda, became the Speaker of the House, so that's a big deal. It's a big deal for Seiwakai, the Abe faction. So his faction has more members than the next 2 factions combined, almost. So it's one of the largest, and so he carries a lot of weight, even though he doesn't have a real firm grasp on all of the cabinet seats. He has a couple of significant ones, primarily Hagiuda, who is the Minister of Trade and Industry, and also the Minister of Finance, who is his brother-in-law. Those are pretty big deals, but it's not everything. So he has to, pretty much do with what he has. The next biggest faction, it's actually tied for first and second place with Mr. Aso and Mr. Motegi, who just took over from the head of his faction with the Heisei Ken. So you've got Mr. Aso, who's got 54, Mr. Motegi, who's got 53, Mr. Abe has 96. Then you've got Mr. Nikai, who was the Secretary General, who was kind of eased out, replaced by Mr. Motegi. He is still a power base. He's one of the most friendly to China LDP politicians. He continues to wield considerable influence. Under him is Mr. Kishida, who has the same number as the Nikai faction, 47. And so for the prime minister to really push his issues forward, he needs to have a coalition of other people, and it's almost always going to be whatever coalition he can have against the Abe faction. So there is a clear break between Abe and Kishida. It used to be, if it wasn't for Mr. Abe, Mr. Kishida would never have been prime minister. Mr. Abe didn't promote somebody within his faction, within the Seiwakai, as a candidate for prime minister. He did promote Takeichi, who took over as a party post rather than a cabinet post. But Mr. Kishida is always facing an alliance with Motegi and Aso, not so much Nikai. As a consequence of that, there have been a couple of groups that have grown up who aren't political factions within the LDP, but they're fingercoat groups. One is by Mr. Tanigaki, the other is by Mr. Suga, as you might expect, there was a lot of curiosity. Mr. Suga was the first prime minister to be elected without a party faction. He didn't head a faction. He didn't even have a faction. Since he was prime minister, now he's collected a group of people. So some of the people who are in his group, they're independents, but some of them also belong to other factions too. They're just kind of vacillating somewhat. And then Mr. Ishiba didn't go away. He lost his leadership. He was, he gave up his leadership of the faction that he created, the Ishiba faction. But it consists of about 10 people in the group. So these could be considered as floaters. They could be considered as people who might join a political faction. The inclusion of just one member to any one of these political factions is a huge deal, and it sometimes does change the dynamic. So Mr. Nikai and Mr. Kishida are neck and neck, same number, 47. For one of them to have an additional member is a big deal because of the way that voting is counted in Japanese politics. So it's a dynamic that will continue to influence how Mr. Kishida runs the country, but also how he's able to get his policies forward. So since the upper house election is in July, the number of bills under consideration has been reduced so that people can be better prepared for election campaigning, and also the issues that will be debated for inclusion into potentially making law. The fights are sometimes going to be less fractious as they might normally be because of the upper house election. So you might have heard of the Supreme Court ruling. I'm changing subjects now. The Supreme Court ruling that said there are many election districts in Japan that are in a state of unconstitutionality. A funny way of saying there are too many Diet members for the number of voters that are in those districts. And the Supreme Court should have said that those election districts, the representation, you have, the number of votes to elect a member of the Diet in those districts is disproportionate. So you have people that are in Tokyo who really should have more representation because of the population, but you have people in the districts, in the real rural districts, who have large numbers of politicians for voting purposes, but you don't have it supported by the number of voters. So the Supreme Court reviewed that, and they should have said, it's unconstitutional, you need to fix it, but they chickened out. And they said it is in a state of unconstitutionality. So it didn't mean that they changed it right away, but it did put the flame there. And so there are a couple of districts that are ripe for change. One of those is the district that the Mr. Abe comes from, and also Mr. Hayashi, who is the current foreign minister. And they come from the same election district. When these votes are counted, one of those seats has to be given up. And in fact, there are several areas like that are in this state of unconstitutionality. In order to fix that, according to what the Supreme Court said, they have to do gerrymandering and reduce some of the seats in these districts. And there are probably about 70 members of the parliament who would be potentially affected. They would either lose a seat in their district, or they personally would lose a seat. They have to run for election for a reduced number of seats the next time the lower house has an election. So given that Mr. Kishida is just a newly minted prime minister, we've got an election for the upper house in 6 months. It is unlikely that there will be a snap election so that the upper house and the lower house have an election at the same time in July. It is unlikely at this point. It is also unlikely that there will be a call for no confidence against the Kishida administration. So this current batch of people who were voted in as lower house members this last time, 2 or 3 months ago, are likely to live out their term, and the election where the gerrymandering laws would occur will not be for another 3 years. Still, this decision on gerrymandering needs to occur before the upper house election. Not that it's going to affect the upper house election because it's only dealing with the lower house, but there is a huge fight going on now. And Mr. Abe is saying, why don't we just kick this can down the road? Let's not decide it this time, even though the Supreme Court has imposed on us that we need to change it. The Speaker of the House, Mr. Hosoda, who was sitting in the Seiwakai top seat just until this last election, also endorses that idea, which is funny because he's the Speaker of the House. He shouldn't be commenting in an area where, it has such a big impact politically on his former faction as the biggest faction in the parliament. So there is a huge fight going on there. one of the ideas that's being proposed is, let's not deal with this one this year. Let's make it so that we take away, instead of taking away 3 seats in the lower house in these rural districts and distributing them, those 3 seats, to the more populated areas, for example, Tokyo, Osaka, and Kanagawa. Let's kick it down the road. So we'll increase the numbers that we're going to talk about, maybe 10 seats in rural areas, and redistribute them to 10 seats in the more populated area. Let's kick that down, and let's talk about that in maybe 2040. 2040, that's, oh my gosh, how can you even do that? But this is a huge fight that's going to be going on. If you're a constitutional scholar and you follow the Constitution and you believe what the Supreme Court says, it's not an issue that you can just push away. This will be an issue that comes up. I hope I've given you a little bit of flavor on how to watch that and what the dynamics are. As the upper house election approaches, we'll be talking more about what the dynamics are of the upper house. There's a proportional representation, and then there's the single seat representation. We'll talk about that as that approaches and it becomes more and more important. Komeito, as you know, is a coalition partner with the LDP. It's beginning to show some strain. Komeito is an alliance figure with the LDP. Because of that alliance, the LDP coalition has a majority in both houses, almost a supermajority in the lower house. With the upper house election, it is likely that it has a supermajority in both houses, which is why it's important to move on the referendum for revising the Constitution. If the LDP has, in a coalition with Komeito, has 2/3, then it can push the bill through and open it up for a referendum for 50% of the population of Japan to vote on. The funny thing is that Komeito and the LDP, they have differences of opinion on a couple of things, and one of them is on how to vote for candidates. So there are some districts where the LDP could run a candidate and the Komeito could run a candidate, but there are other seats where instead of going toe-to-toe against each other, one of the parties would give up the candidate so the other party would win by default. So it's I scratch your back, you scratch my back. Even though the LDP has the predominant number of members in the parliament, having the coalition does help the LDP maintain that majority. And Komeito, as a consequence, gets a cabinet seat, so they can say that they're part of the government, they are in the government to their voters. The problem is that the question of reliability and credibility of the LDP sticking with that. And you've noticed that Ishin, which is a political party that's in the opposition, but it has philosophical positions much closer to the LDP than Komeito has with the LDP. And Ishin did so well in this last election that their weight within the parliament is almost greater than what Komeito is. So there's this issue, and politics is, makes strange bedfellows. There is this issue, or this concept that Ishin is more politically aligned to the issues of the LDP than Komeito, and it could be that the coalition falls apart, and a lot of that would depend on what happens in the lower house, in the upper house elections. So it's something to be watching very closely. In terms of China, the status of the self-defense forces, the U.S.-Japan relationship, and the Constitution, those are the issues that Ishin and Komeito are different from. And on those specific issues, Ishin is more closely aligned to the position of the LDP. Nevertheless, Mr. Suga and Mr. Nikai, the two factions that I talked about, Mr. Suga has a group, and Mr. Nikai has, a political faction that has the same number of members as Mr. Kishida's faction. They are proponents and very close to Komeito. So this dynamic also influences how politics will move, how we line up for, coalition partners in anticipation of the upper house election, and also fights that are going on inside the Diet now on televised, debates for everybody to see how those questions come up and how much heat the prime minister gets. I think I've gone on way too long about some of the inside workings of the parliament. I hope it hasn't been too thick, and it's useful in understanding what is going on in Japanese politics. I'd like to end my comments there and open the room up. I see a lot of, our regular Japan hands. I hope you don't throw me to the wolf, who is otherwise known as Maya, so that she asked me, this list of questions she's been jotting down. So please, somebody help me here. Maya?
Yes, thank you for the great briefing again today. You mentioned that Mr. Suga has formed a new group, and I wonder whether that group has the potential to become another faction within
Yes.
LDP.
Right. So usually that's what happens. Usually there is a progeny of how a political faction starts within the LDP or within any political party. And the other political parties, even the opposition parties, have factions within them. They're just not defined. They're not formalized. Within the LDP, the reason why the LDP is so big is because it's like a tent that encompasses lots of different groupings. So it's an amalgamation of various groups that are pretty much defined by political personalities. So that's a kind of defining character of the LDP. So in any faction, in any grouping that starts, it usually starts with, for example, a study group. And study groups are born and die all the time within the LDP. It might be because of heat not burn tobacco, or about autonomous driving. There are people that are just interested in this sort of thing, or they have a constituency in their election district that is promoting some certain aspect. So they start a study group. The study group begins to take steam. Maybe there's money that's generated as a consequence of this particular issue. It becomes a hot button issue. And this study group could turn into a group. So the groups that have formed under Tanigaki, Mr. Suga, and Mr. Ishiba, yes, for Mr. Suga, it seems like that is the natural course. Without a political faction, without an affiliation, without a reliance on anybody other than maybe Mr. Abe, who made him prime minister, there are people who glom onto him because they're independents, for example, or maybe because they're disenfranchised members of other political factions. So from a group into a faction. So starting a faction, it has been quite a while since a faction has been started, a formal faction. You need to have a certain number, I think it's 12 people to initiate a faction. And then when you have a faction, then you have a seat at the table. You probably have political funds that are being dedicated to you from the party, as long as you follow, party principles. So it is likely that Mr. Suga's group could turn into a political faction. It's a little bit early to say. More likely, what happens is that just before election, the group is absorbed by, or part of it is absorbed by, one of the political factions. So as you know, that there's a furious fight between Nikai and Mr. Kishida because the numbers in their political faction is the same number, and they don't want to be seen as similar. They, somebody's got to be a top dog, and of course, everybody's shooting for the Abe faction. So the more likely scenario is that they get the members get robbed, or they just a decision is made or a scandal happens, and then people get disenfranchised and the group disbands.
You mentioned that politics makes strange bedfellows, and that ideologically, Ishin-no-kai and LDP are more closely aligned than the LDP and Komeito. So I wonder if there is a possibility that for the next upper house elections, so LDP actually forms an alliance with Ishin-no-kai rather than with Komeito.
Exactly what I was kind of getting at. It's the time between now and then is so short that for something like that to happen, it would have to be really dramatic. It's more likely that after the election, Komeito doesn't do so well and Ishin does really well, and the push for the constitutional reform, which Komeito is not for, it's not in favor of, that could be the trigger for switching horses there. It's unlikely that it would happen before the election. It's too shaky. And Komeito, the LDP doesn't want to dump Komeito because the Komeito always brings in the voters. There's a lot that can be said about Komeito, especially if you're a business person and you want your company to be rich and you want your workers to scrape by with the salaries that you give them. Komeito is much more kind-hearted. It's much more about the social network, the social fabric. Ishin is a little bit more towards the business end. It started in Osaka and grew out of Osaka. So the influence of being an Osaka center of gravity is more geared towards the business end of politics rather than the social fabric. So it is likely, but the elections with the the Komeito machine always producing the votes, and in coalition with the LDP, they would bring an additional number of votes to LDP candidates in those areas where there is not a Komeito candidate. So that alliance, that configuration, has been tried and true for the last 15 years. So it's hard to throw it away, except after the election, then it would probably be, you've only got 20 members of the parliament, whereas now Ishin has 25 or 26 or maybe 30. So yeah, that kind of calculus would go into play.
I cannot wait to see what happens.
But every day's interesting in Japanese politics, that's for sure.
Indeed. Hiroaki, good morning.
Good morning, Hiroaki.
You are talking about the domestic politics, especially the power game within the LDP factions, or maybe possibility of a coalition with a different party like Ishin no Kai or another. I'm proposing the big Kochikai, Dai Kochikai initiative. Proposed by Vice Secretary General Asfo.
Yep.
Also, Kishida is interested in it. So, for stabilizing the power balance within LDP, I'm wondering whether Kishida is going to that direction, like forming the political study group on Big Kochikai soon or not, or maybe I don't know how Prime Kishida is seeing the emergence of new coalition within the LDP. Like you mentioned the Suga group as a threat to the Kishida's factions, or possible partner with this Kochikai faction. Also, I'm wondering, is there any possibility in the LDP to see an issue-based coalition of different factions? Because within the LDP, as far as I know, so many difference in the policies, especially maybe China. China is a political important things. I'm wondering such kind of issue-based coalition within the different factions could emerge, especially like grouping of like, for example, like more pro-China groups, like seeking the economic relationships or developing the economic relationship with China more, proactively, like join something like a group to discuss, like, or pushing such, policy forward, especially like, of course, there are many debate on like, whether Japan could or should invite, President Xi Jinping to our country on occasion of the 50th anniversary of normalization of diplomatic relationship. Timing is, of course, debatable, but, simply whether we could or should invite President Xi Jinping to our country, pushing our relationship with China forward. So on this point, whether we know Prime Minister Kishida could seek some kind of issue-based coalition for this kind of like political agenda, or thirdly, before this like election in our country, is there any possibility of like changing of some how could I say ministers or some high official within the cabinet?
Great question.
Possible or not for making this like LDPs like big winning in the elections. This is my interest to know.
Okay.
If you have anything on that, like I highly appreciate that.
Thank you very much. Let me just focus of the 54 things that you said. Let me just focus on 3 of them.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first is about issue politics. Is there a possibility of, some issue unifying and maybe making within the factional system some new kind of, not a faction, but a group that would be based on the issue? And this comes up pretty frequently. And the thing about it is that the LDP, it's a huge machine. It dominates Japanese politics, and there are really brilliant people that are working inside the LDP. They're not members of parliament. They're professionals. They're really skilled at what they do. And when issues come up that have good legs on them, these are identified and groomed and massaged and vetted so that at the right time, it's most likely that the LDP is going to grab that issue and make it their own, even though it might have started someplace else. So issues that come up, it might be championed by one of the factions, and then it becomes kind of the flag that they get their groups in. But one of the beauties of having a political faction, or actually having a political party, it's more, I think, more closely controlled at the faction level, is that when the leader says, this is the issue that we're going to believe in, and even though you might think it stinks or it doesn't benefit you, as a member of this political faction, because we have breakfast once a week, we all know each other, we help each other get elected. When it's time for you, we give you money so that you can get the vote out. And when you've been in trouble, we've helped you with whatever. You will vote along this line. And they do. They do, or they get chastised, they get pushed aside, they eventually become an independent, or they maybe even switch, factional affiliation. But more often than not, when they vote as a faction and when the LDP votes as a party in bills, in the passage of bills, it is almost by lockstep, and everybody toes the line. So when a bill is proposed by the LDP, since it has the dominant power there, and if the vote is a 51% vote, then the LDP is going to get it, as long as they stay in cohesion. And that they spend a lot of time and energy on that, and the repercussions for not towing the line are very high and well talked about, and people spread the story, so you don't want to get your nose in the wrong place. The second issue that you talked about was the visit to Japan of the president of China, which was on the boards. It was going to happen. He was going to come. They had the New Otani Hotel already booked out. They had all of the cars reserved months in advance for this huge delegation. It was going to happen, and then COVID hit. So this was under Mr. Abe's watch. It was going to be a great visit, a great celebration. It looks to me to be very unlikely that would happen, that reception would be there. There's still a lot of animosity. There's a lot of fear. The Chinese are doing a lot of things that ratchet up, tensions within the region. Even at the anniversary and celebration of the two countries, diplomatically it makes sense for there to be a visit. But I think given the geopolitics, I think that is really unlikely. And then your final point was, I'm trying to remember your final point. It wasn't your final point. It was the final point that I wanted to focus on.
Possibility of changing the ministers,
yes,
or like
that's right.
members. Yeah.
So that's always very carefully watched. Mr. Kishida's cabinet is in place now. People are always watching for who is the loose cannon, who's going to go drinking in Ginza, who is whatever the story is. People are, opposition parties are, longing for that. And they call these ministers on the mat. They ask them tough questions. That's going on right now. It looks like the slate is pretty clean, and that the cabinet is pretty well unified behind Mr. Kishida. With everybody focused on the upper house elections, it is unlikely that you're going to have some sort of a scandal. It could happen. It always happens in Japanese politics. In fact, you can't talk about Japanese politics without discussing the role of scandals as how it dictates and drives issues and drives the response of the government to certain issues, or the stability or the confidence that people have in the leadership. So far, so good. But the more important thing and the more reliable thing to watch is this tension between former Prime Minister Abe, who is in the wings, and Mr. Kishida, who is reliant on the Aso faction and the Motegi faction to overcome the dominance of the Abe faction. So that coalition exists. It is being fostered and developed every day. And there are reports that come out where it talks about, the Prime Minister meeting with Mr. Aso and Motegi, and Mr. Abe is not invited to sit at the table, and these kinds of things. And it just begins to filter out. It makes some people more angry. It makes the former prime minister more angry that he's not included, even though he wields considerable power. And you guys are kind of, squeezing me out. So I'm going to tweak you by saying something. I'm going to make a press conference. I'm going to say something that is against your interest. That's the more likely, the more reliable thing to watch, rather than the advent of some scandal, which I think is pretty much on the low possibility scale at this particular point in time.
Mhm.
Great questions, and I appreciate that.
Because I'm wondering about the U.S. ambassador Emmanuel arrived to Japan. So
Yes.
Friday, Emmanuel also had a meeting with this Kishida.
Yes.
Emmanuel was supposed to, post it in the Chinese side, right? China, not Japan. Original plan was, but finally he came to Japan. I highly appreciate came to Japan. I didn't see any move of Emmanuel, his role in the Indo-Pacific, because I haven't seen any move like Emmanuel's to Chinese side or Taiwan side, as far as I know. So you know that what kind of role Emmanuel is expected to role and play in this country or Indo-Pacific. Also wondering.
Yes.
Just my idea is because Emmanuel just passed this uniform of Chicago Cubs certified socks to the Prime Minister Kishida.
That's right.
Also Kishida also fan of this baseball
Cubs.
Hiroshima Toyo Cup. Also
Yes.
I'm wondering whether it is strange, but I'm wondering whether we could have a baseball diplomacy among the U.S., Japan, or also China. Because Xi Jinping also had a study abroad in USA. I'm not sure he had a chance to watch this baseball match in USA. But whether they can have chance to see this a baseball match in this country, Japan. I'm suggesting Yokohama Bay Stars. Also Hiroshima Cubs match in the Yokohama Bay, stadium. Watched by President Biden, Prime Minister Xi Jinping for peaceful, how could I say, gathering. Sorry, last one is just my strange thought, but I want to wondering the U.S. ambassador Emmanuel's role
Okay.
in this regard. Yes, thanks.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, of course, sure, please.
Okay. So, as everybody knows, the embassy has been without an ambassador for 2.5 years. And I think we understand what the ambassador's marching orders are from Washington, D.C. And I think it's very suitable to his personality. He has a reputation as being, really outspoken and kind of a hard-nosed negotiator. And look at his pedigree and his career. He's really done some incredible things in his career. And I think he's young. I think he's maybe 62. He has boundless energy. He looks great. He's tanned. He works out. And I think the atmosphere and the environment is right for him to really reassert America's diplomatic presence in Tokyo. And I think he'll kick butt. And I think these ideas about baseball diplomacy, we're only seeing a hint of that. I don't know what kind of legs it has on it, but anything that generates better cohesion and better friendship and affiliation between Japan and the United States, you can believe that he is going to be putting a lot of emphasis on that. The U.S.-Japan alliance is so important. It's already strong. It needs to be stronger. And the united front against what it appears to be China's interest in the Taiwan Straits is opposed to the United States primarily, but Japan as well. Japan's biggest trade partner is China, so it's sitting in a very delicate position. It needs to endorse and support what the United States is doing, and of course, as a democracy and as a capitalized economy, a lot of interests merge. But China is huge; it dominates the world in economy and in trade, and Japan is sitting in a very delicate position. So I'm predicting that the Rahm Emanuel administration of the U.S. Embassy will be remarkable. I think there will be a lot of things that come out of it. There'll be a lot of flash. There'll be a lot of things going on here, and a lot of issues that are being showcased by the United States in terms of, not just defense capabilities, cybersecurity. Cybersecurity means, business and means, 5G and beyond 5G. It means a lot of different things that help an economy become strong and consistent and reliable. And that's what the Japanese economy really needs. And I think you'll see a lot of cooperation between the United States and Japan to achieve those ends and to help Japan become, the kind of, it wants to be a leader. It wants to be a leader in cybersecurity. In fact, it wants the digital agency to be a pinnacle of how governments and how economies can work under the management of a central government that has its fingers in how things are being done and how decisions are being made and how money is being spent. Right now, you can do that through the budget office or through, the Ministry of Finance, watching how money is being spent. But this is a far better, far more effective way to do it. It just, the rollout time is significant. So there's plenty of reason to be hopeful. It's great that he is now here. I don't think he's presented himself to the emperor. I suspect that he will be presenting his credentials this next week. He has been out in public. He's finished his quarantine. He was outside. He's making calls. So I think probably if he hasn't presented his credentials yet, I don't think he has. It's high time he does because he's already making calls. I hope that responds somewhat, Hiroaki. And thank you for the last question that you're allowed to ask.
And Ellen, good evening to you.
Oh, hello. I want to share something that we have. We play a little bit of a game the other day with our colleagues to compare the things that you mentioned, Timothy. The Prime Minister Kishida and President Biden had a television online meeting, and White House released some statement, which is the one that Maya has pinned up there for us. And also the Japanese Prime Minister office also released statements. So we thought it would be interesting to compare the two different releases to see what Japan said and what the White House said. And this game turned out to be a little bit more discoveratory or discovering than we anticipated. And we found many differences. But I don't think we are going to talk all of them. But I thought there are three areas that the White House released or made a statement that the Prime Minister's office made zero comment. As you know, in Japan, not only the Prime Minister's office, but also the Foreign Ministry will also make a press release. So we actually compare two press releases from Japan and with the White House. So I'm going to talk about three sentences in that White House statement that were completely ignored by the Japanese side. And I'm not going to make any judgmental statement. And I'd like to hear your judgmental statement, Timothy, and Maya, if you will. Why Japan didn't even mention these three statements? Are you ready? Just three. The first one is that President Biden welcomed Prime Minister's intent to revise Japan's national security strategy and other key guiding documents. The White House used the word revise, but Prime Minister's office and Foreign Minister's office, they made no comment about that. They talked about revising Japan's national security strategy. That's the first thing. Do you want to make a judgmental statement here before we move to the second one, or do you think this is just too minor, not even worth our time to share your thoughts?
No, I actually think it's a big deal. Mr. Kishida said early in his administration that this is one of his priorities, and I think that is in line with what the United States wants to do too, and also the revision of the Japanese Constitution to acknowledge the existence of the self-defense forces and their ability for potentially first strike capabilities, and also offensive, maybe sharing with the United States, maybe independently developing them. So I think that there's a lot of interest, especially from the United States Embassy point of view, and also from the Pentagon, to move forward with a revision of the agreement.
Yeah, it's interesting that the Japan side didn't want to mention that they talked about this with President Biden.
But that makes sense.
Yeah, that's
that makes sense.
Yeah. All right. The second a press release statement that was completely ignored or not mentioned on the Japan side is this President Biden applauded Japan and Australia signing of the RAA, the reciprocal access agreement that will enable closer trilateral defense cooperation. They talked about this. White House made a statement about this, but on Japan side, they didn't mention this. What do you think about this, Timothy? I'd like to hear your opinion.
I think that there is an allergy to talk about to talk about defense capabilities and about the various alliances. I think particularly in lining up for the upper house election, there's such sensitivity. I think most people in Japan understand or acknowledge the threat from North Korea, and it keeps getting worse. And they also acknowledge, the importance of the Taiwan Straits and the free flow of commerce in the region, and the just the horrible coming up. But people don't want to be actually confronted with that. They don't want to talk about, more militarism in Japan. And also, when you talk about militarism in Japan, it almost, by its very nature, inflects, more United States involvement in what's going on in Japan, in terms of, Okinawa, in terms of a lot of different things that, the Japanese, there's a very high percentage of people that want to preserve the peace constitution. They don't want to be involved in these kinds of things. But I think, unfortunately, diplomacy and geopolitics is kind of dictating that Japan, take a stand. And there's also a significant number of people, more increasingly, that don't want to always have to rely on the United States to provide for, protection or defense capabilities. That it's high time the Japanese are able to do that on their own.
Thank you. That's interesting. And the last one, the White House release mentioned the word Quad. Australia, Japan, India, and the U.S. The press release says the two leaders highlighted the importance of Quad as a critical forum for promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific region, and blah, blah, blah. Japan side did not even use a single word of Quad at all in their release about what they talked with President Biden. Maybe we are reading too much, but it was interesting that they avoided the Quad in their release.
My only comment on maybe the lack of mention of Quad is because I think from the Japanese perspective, it's a little bit of a snooze fest. It sure would be nice to be able to say with any degree of credibility, this alliance, India, Australia, Japan, and the United States are unified in this encroachment by China, and we are going to provide a united front. Yeah, I don't know. I don't see much of an Indian emphasis on that. I think that they have their own issues, and they share a border with China, but it seems like it's not even really part of this part of the world, although it's grouped together. Australia, similarly, they have a lot to lose, a lot to benefit from, China being strong and powerful, not so much to benefit as nobody really does except for China on, a stronger presence in the South Pacific and the islands, and being able to expand their the economic zones, the shipping lanes. But I think it really is, although we talk about Quad, it really is just the United States and Japan. It would be nice, the French are being involved, the English, the Australians in terms of naval. But I think when it all is said and done, it really, the United States is the big gorilla, and Japan is more bound to the United States than Australia is bound to the United States, or certainly India is bound to the United States. So it does seem like a kind of unbalanced, kind of quadrennial relationship. But I think it's somewhat grasping at straws. Hopefully, the Indians and the Australians will pony up and participate and hold it in the reverence that the United States and Japan does. But I think the balance of realities are that it's it's not quite like that. And I think that's why we get such a lukewarm response. It is very hopeful, but I think it's not based too much in
But would you
hard
say
reality. My own opinion.
thank you. But would you say in Japanese politics, mentioning quad is more of a liability than a benefit? That's why they avoided saying that.
Ferran, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. I have a question to understand a bit more about the LDP politics, because it feels like sometimes that it's more important for Japan than dynamics between parties. I wanted to ask whether the members inside each faction generally stick to the same political line, whether it's ideology that glues the faction together, or so they have clearly distinct agendas, or is it something else? And if that's the case, how would you rank them? How would you rank them in the conservative progressive spectrum? Thank you.
Gosh, I'm going to say something that's very maybe off color, and I apologize, but being a politician in contemporary Japanese politics, I shouldn't use the word. You do what you have to do in order to stay elected, and being affiliated with a political party, whether you're opposition member or, usually that's where it begins. When you decide to run for office, or that you've been encouraged by somebody to run for office, it's because of what you said or what you stood for or what issues you're championing. And then it starts from there. And then as you fall into the fold and you're going to run under the banner of Ishin or Komeito or LDP, then your political career begins to get groomed and refined. And I think once you've crossed that river and you've made that decision, that career change, you want to have a career as a politician. You don't want to go back to selling insurance. You don't want to go back to being a company man. You want to be a politician. This is the highest elevation that you can come to. Very, very rarely will you be an ambassador. Ambassadors are generally picked from the foreign ministry. They're career bureaucrats. So as a person in the economy, a person of some standing or in business, that highest pinnacle is considered by many to be as a politician. So whatever issue gets you there, that's the one you're going to champion. So in talking with a lot of politicians, their heart isn't in it. Their heart is in getting reelected. So it's kind of, it sounds not very beautiful. There are some politicians that write books about positions that they have taken and stances that they have. That gets you into a little bit of trouble too when you actually reveal yourself. Look what happened to Shintaro Ishihara. He was despised by many for actually talking about how he felt about Japanese race and foreigners and women and all sorts of things. At least you knew where he stood, but it didn't make him a very popular. He was a successful politician, but it's like in Japanese companies, and we all have worked in Japanese companies, I guess, or in Japanese social structures. You keep your head down. You don't wear loud clothing. You don't paint your fingernails green. You kind of are trying to be a little bit milder than you normally would be, because you just want to stay where you are. You don't want to rock the boat. And I think in politics, that is as true as it is anywhere else in Japanese society. You just want to be elected. So it's you would like to see that there are champions that really hold particular issues close to their heart. And there are some people who have, become elected, they've been identified as a potential politician because of a stance or because they suffered from some certain situation. They become the champion or the darling of that issue. But there are a lot of politicians. There are 750 odd politicians. So there are different flavors, but the dynamics are that once you're a politician, you want to remain a politician, because after being a politician, there's not much left there. You can't go back to selling insurance. It's a wilderness after that. You could become like a lobbyist or maybe a college professor, but the leap from the pinnacle to being just a regular Joe again is so stark and so distasteful that most people would just swallow hard and toe the party line. I hope that's somewhat responsive. A great question.
So you might have just follow up quickly then. Whenever there's a new guy in the LDP, he or she just joins the faction of the previous faction of that district, for example? Or how would they choose a faction?
So typically, if they're going to become a politician, somebody within one of the factions has said, I knew your dad. Your dad was a great guy, and he ran a company. He gave my campaign lots of money when I was running. And you're 34 years old, and we have a spot that's opening up in the election district, in the same prefecture, but it's election district over. And I would like to sponsor you as a candidate. So if you'd like to do that, then we'll help you we'll give you, training on talking with crowds. We'll give you training on speaking to television reporters, and we'll give you campaign funds to kind of get your picture up and get that out. If you're game for that, we think you'd make a great candidate. And they might do that for 6 or 7 people, and then the one person who kind of goes through that vetting process is their champion. And then because of this sense of obligation and duty, and you've helped me here, you fall into line with that. And once that's established, you almost always stick with it. Look at Konotaro. Even though he got kind of kicked in the teeth by his faction leader, he still is in that faction. He still is towing the line because that faction helped him get elected and reelected. Well, not only that, but I mean, with him, he's a third generation politician. So people who kind of do that and switch party affiliations or faction affiliations, there is a color that is ascribed to that, disloyalty and inconsistency and those kinds of attributes that Japanese in particular place a high value on being solid and consistent. So that's how people become factional members. And sometimes you might just run as an independent, and then once you're elected, now you can kind of play the field. You can go to Motegi, you can go to Kishida, you can go to Abe. You're playing the field because you're looking for, I'm a Ichinensei. And the worst place to be is Ichinensei. Ichinensei means it's your first election. You're there for 3 years and 4 years, and you're basically, licking boots. You're doing a lot of things. You're learning in the process, but you really don't have a whole lot of political power. You have to be in that position 4 times, 3 times. That's 12, 15 years. And then you're starting to actually, be assigned committee positions, not sub, members, not, actually being a committee chair or being assigned to foreign services, that sort of thing. And now your prominence actually begins to build. But it takes a while. The guys who are really calling the shots, they've been reelected 15, 16, 17 times. And now you actually are beginning to generate a cadre of people under you who you've groomed, who you've convinced to run for election. They're maybe a second year or third year politician, and all of a sudden you have a group of soldiers that you can rely on. I hope that's somewhat responsive, but once again, it's a great question.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, Ferran. And we have one question via the back channel. So is it possible that North Korea could continue to fire missiles towards Japan without China's permission?
It is not only possible, it is likely. It is likely. And the North Koreans, as the question kind of suggests, they are generating a little bit of displeasure from China for doing that. They're kind of ratcheting it up. And I think the end game is that, once again, they want to be invited to the table. They want to be considered as an equal, and that their concerns are going to be weighed equally, and that they would receive financial assistance and UNESCO funding and economic development, that sort of thing. I think that's the game that they're playing, because they have put so much money into the defense and to the militarization, and the economy and the people have suffered incredibly as a consequence of it. But that is their strategy, and it seems to be a strategy that is working for them.
Thank you for this, Rich. I hope this answers your question. And so thank you very much, Timothy. Thank you, Ren and Hiroaki Ferran, for coming up.
I know you're in the process of wrapping up this room. Before, let me just interject one more time. Congratulations. This is our first 52nd consecutive week on Briefing on Japanese Politics. You are amazing for having, marshaled this, gotten this together, put the pistol to my head, and made sure that I showed up every Sunday. And, the audience has grown, and it's just, not only that, but we're also beginning to port over to LinkedIn. So, for example, this morning we started 15 minutes earlier on LinkedIn. We did some live streaming there, and then came over to Clubhouse. But you're always pushing the envelope. You're always encouraging me and pushing me to, be crisper, to be shorter, to be more accurate. And as a consequence, this room just continues to get better and better. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Timothy, for choosing life, first of all. Yes, and for sticking around, coming to the room every week, prepared and briefing us. Well, I have to say thank you to you for your commitment once again. Thank you to everybody who has been with us for this 1 year. We wouldn't have been able to do it without you. And thank you for your questions, comments, commentaries, and everything. We appreciate it very much. Thank you very much, Mihoko and Tim Sullivan, Rich, Ren, Hiroaki Ferran, and everybody else who has been here once again.
What a great audience! I'm
great
so
audience.
impressed.
Yes.
So many Japan hands, so many people who actually know a lot about what's going on, and this is just adding a little bit of spice to what people already know. So it makes the room a lot easier, a lot more. It's a richer dialogue. So
Indeed.
it's not Japanese politics 101. In order to have this conversation, people already understand a lot of the basic essentials about how things work. What is the structure? What's coming down on the schedule. So what an enriching experience. Thank you.
This was Japan Expert Insights Room on Japanese politics. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air next Sunday at 8:30 in the morning, Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Again, we're looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and enjoy every day as much as possible. See you!